Thank you. That was fascinating. Fantastic. I've got a quick three-part question. First, can you give us your view on how far across the parental institutions that were involved in this case the criminal culpability for what happened extended? Second, how confident are you that the system that caused this problem is capable of actually getting to the point of prosecuting any of those individuals? And how confident are you that any of them will actually see what Seema called for earlier, namely time behind bars?
Okay. I think that criminal culpability definitely sits in the post office, definitely sits to some extent in Fujitsu. I think it's going to be less easy for any prosecuting authority to extend that into the government from what we've seen so far. I think there's definitely some very negligent behaviour, some of that sort of first level of abuse of trust within government, but I'm not sure that second level of crossing the line into actively bad faith. I haven't seen evidence for that yet in the inquiry. As for what do I think the chances are, my feeling is that if no prosecutions are brought at all, then there'd be likely to be some kind of private prosecution, some kind of crowdfund. And I think that the risk of that will mean that the authorities feel that at their heels and that they will feel that they have to do something. Now, the trouble is, how high will they go? And that's the problem, because I think it'll be easy enough to pick off the low-hanging fruit. How far will they go up the tree?
Really heartbreaking listening to the stories, and especially Seema's account. Personally, I'm just concerned as to, is it purely human nature, and as you say, the rational choice theory, the fact that humans act in their best interests? Do we have real hope? I mean, we've talked in leadership terms. We have inclusive leadership, we have servant leadership, which accounts for the flatter structure you mentioned. But we've also seen what happens to whistleblowers. When people have raised their head above the parapet, the treatment they receive and the future employability, the adverse impact on that, is it ever likely to change, that these hierarchical structures will give the power to the ground floor and be leading bottoms up? And although it is very heartwarming to hear that there's more being done, is there real hope for changing what seems to be human nature?
Okay, so I think what Eleanor Ostrom's research shows is that it isn't human nature. It's about structures, it's about systems, and human nature is, as she put it, much, much more complicated than the idea that we're all perfectly rational, self-interested beings. We respond to the structures around us. I think that the issue around whistleblowers is very telling of the structure and the system within Fujitsu, particularly. Post office as well, but Fujitsu particularly, because many, many people worked in the support departments that were hacking into sub-postmasters' branches. They must have known, they did know that it was wrong. One whistleblower in all of those years, and he didn't whistleblow to Fujitsu, he whistleblew to the BBC Panorama team. And that tells you all you need to know about the rot in Fujitsu, that they didn't have an open door policy for people to come and talk to the powers that be at all. They didn't want to know. So I think what it's about is about corporates and governments having to really reset and accept, okay, we've got a hierarchy. We can't get away from that. There is a hierarchy, but we at the top of the hierarchy are going to exercise our power benignly.
I wonder if you could say something about the trade unions and whether they were an institution that could be described as a good parent. What was their role? Because no mention of them tonight.
Yes, well, I expect some of you know only too well how badly the postmasters were let down by the National Federation for Sub-Postmasters. And it's an interesting case in point because they were in effect in hock to the post office. They took all their money from the post office ultimately, and I think it's a reflection of the way that the post office exercised its parental power, that it just bought the NFSP. And some of the communications between the NFSP and the post office make it clear that they were in this kind of, how can I put it, within a sort of a system where you try to divide and rule. You let some people have a bit more power and you keep the others right down. And the NFSP were definitely in that we've got a bit more power category. And they were kept there by the post office using them. So, unions. Probably too big a question whether they can ever exercise their power in a benign way. I'm sure they can, but the NFSP certainly couldn't, sadly.
Flora, thank you so much. I have a question from the perspective of the child. So given that we are all children by reference to the system, by your analogy, what is it that we can do that means that we don't remain Peter Pans to the system? There must be something. It can't just be only one way, although it must absolutely be one way. But what can the collective do in relation to this?
I suppose we have to try to keep ourselves informed, and that need for the institutions to be open is something that we have to keep pressing at and prizing at. There's been some real heroes in the post office saga who've used freedom of information requests to find things out, to keep pressing. They're still at it. The wonderful El Sheikh, who discovered the deeply, disgustingly racist documents that were in circulation in the post office, is currently trying to find out why there's been certain government documents that have not appeared in the inquiry. So good luck to her elbow on that, and we'll see whether she finds things out. So yes, I think it's about trying to keep pressing the institutions to be more open. I think it's probably also not letting ourselves be gulled by the false, be part of us, bring your collective power to us, the spin, the nonsense, which is just hiding the true power dynamic.
Is there any reason to suppose that the post office management, top brass, will improve, will change? Is there any sight of a new post office?
Absolutely none, I'm afraid. I mean, maybe Nigel Railton, relatively new chair, let's see. But there's been such a whirlwind of change at the top of the post office. And to my mind, the middle management and below is exactly the same as it ever was. And they just let the newcomers come and go and wait for them to be off, because they're off before too long. And then you just carry on. The old guard are still there doing what they do.
Is there any evidence that sub-postmastering remains an attractive thing for people to do, or are they struggling to get sub-postmasters?
I think they must be struggling. I don't know what the figures are on that, but certainly figures that came out said that 50% of post offices are making something like, I think if I remember rightly, something like £4,000 a year or less. Many of them not even making that much. I mean, that's unsustainable, isn't it?
One of the things that's impressed me about from the inquiry is the professed enormous pride in the ignorance of the higher-ups of knowledge of IT and to some extent legal matters. And we saw that quite a lot in the Fujitsu saga where the technical people were saying this EPOS stuff desperately needs rewriting. The word crap was used at one point. And nothing was done. In fact, they produced a paper which had priorities inverted. It sounded like they'd gone backwards from the answer. And we see it in the post office where Paula Vendels prided herself in knowing nothing about IT, and all the people concerned knew nothing about IT, and so they used that as an excuse for doing nothing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, the lawyers, I think, are to blame for not tackling IT issues, and I think, as you say, boards were to blame for not tackling IT and legal issues. The reason I say lawyers have been to blame for not tackling IT issues is because it's been, I think, very tempting for lawyers to say, oh, well, that's not my domain, I don't know much about that. And I think there's no excuse ever as lawyers to just park an issue because you don't understand it. You have to grapple with IT issues if a case is about IT issues. Yeah.
Flora, thank you for an inspiring lecture. Something that interests me in looking at what went on in the GLO hearings and subsequently is that we have a flaw in our legal system around digital evidence. The fact that the Law Commission recommended, as it were, TAPA's approach to anything digital, it was assumed to be working correctly. As an engineer, I find that a complete anathema. What can we do to change the law?
Well, it's a question that has gone around a little bit, and to my mind, and in fact, Professor Moorhead answered a similar question at his lecture the other day, and I would pretty much echo his argument, which is that actually it's subsumed into a wider question around presumptions. There was never actually, as far as I'm aware, any reference to the presumption that you're referring to in the criminal cases. It was never once referred to in Seema's trial, and we have the full transcripts of that, and I'm not aware of it ever being referred to anywhere. It wasn't really needed, because what the Post Office did was they reversed the whole burden of proof. So they didn't need to rely on Section 69 of PACE. They just said, right, we've spotted that there's some printout here that says there's a loss. You proved to me you didn't steal that money. That was effectively what they did. So, yeah, and then they said, oh, and we won't give you anything that you might need to prove that you didn't steal the money. So, yeah, I think it's wrapped up in a wider question around how the burden of proof was used in the criminal courts, but also in Lee's trial in the civil courts as well. They turned the burden of proof onto Lee in the civil courts as well. Lee's got questions, so we'll make sure that...
Thank you. Your passion is a massive asset to the cause, Flora. What do you think? You've heard all the evidence in the inquiry about the lack of action so far on the part of the Bar Council and the Solicitors Regulatory Authority for the lawyers who put ethics in the dustbin and who put their clients' interests first. Do you have any views on that? And their inactivity, what they should be doing?
Yes, well, I do think that there have been some parts of the testimony in the inquiry that could have been acted on straight away, for sure. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw Jarnail sing. So, yes, I think inaction so far, hopefully, we will see more action. We need to see more action. It's going to be very bad for the legal professions if there isn't serious action taken by the SRA and the BSB. They really need to get on top of this, because it's not. How do we trust the law? I think... Yeah, I was just going to... I think Lee... I don't know where the microphones have gone, but Lee Castleton had a question.
Simon Goldberg stole my question. Can I answer it? Is it possible now, today, for regulators to regulate, particularly legal regulators? Is it really possible to regulate a huge entity, maybe a magic circle or whatever? Is it really possible, and do they have the teeth?
Yeah, really good question. HSF seem to be just trundling along, don't they, without a care in the world. I have more faith that we'll see criminal prosecutions than we'll see proper regulatory action taken, especially against the likes of HSF and some of the other real bigwigs in the law. We'll see. Exactly. That's the trust guardian spiral. And that's why, you know, when it comes to the big institutions, the big firms, it's got to come from within. If they don't change from within, we don't stand a chance.
Flora, could I ask you a question? It's Richard Moorhead here at the back. Oh. You mentioned me, thank you very much. My question is your mum here? She is here, great. Flora's mum has emailed me a couple of times. That's my question, but I'm going to make a point, if I may, if you'll indulge me. I want to say something about the Hamilton case. People may not fully understand this. Some of you will, some of you won't. Flora was part of the legal team that led the charge on ground 2. They did so in the face of extraordinary pressure. It was a really great team. But if I may say so, Flora was probably the only one in the team who really understood it. She was the criminal lawyer, and she was probably the one who had the most to lose if it went badly as a criminal lawyer working in that context. And she showed absolutely incredible courage to run that case in the way she did, as did her clients, as did the other members of the team. And I just wanted to pay tribute to you for that courage, which I think has been truly exceptional.